On the night of the 14th of April 1865, 5 days after the American Civil War had come to an end, with the surrender of General Robert E. Lee, there was a chaotic moment which shook the foundations of America. President Abraham Lincoln, the man who had guided the nation through its bloodiest conflict and preserved the Union, was struck by an assassin's bullet when he was at the theatre. His death became one of the most dramatic moments and also tragic ones in American history, and it changed the course of the nation. The man who fired the shot, John Wilkes Booth, then leapt from the royal box and went on the run, but it was later uncovered the assassination was part of a larger political conspiracy intended to revive the cause of the Confederacy. Abraham Lincoln would succumb to the shot, but what is not as well known is the fact that he was the subject of a grave robbery attempt, in which the tomb of Lincoln was actually opened and his coffin was glimpsed at years after his death. But what happened when the tomb of Lincoln was opened? To support our channel, please make sure to subscribe. By April of 1865, Washington, D.C. was in a celebratory mood. The Civil War, which had lasted 4 long years and claimed more than 600,000 lives, was finally coming to an end. Only a week earlier, Confederate General Robert E. Lee had surrendered to Union General Ulysses S. Grant at Appomattox Courthouse in Virginia. People filled the streets of the Capitol, waving flags, singing patriotic songs, and lighting bonfires. Abraham Lincoln was deeply relieved. Throughout the war, he had carried the immense burden of keeping the Union together, managing generals, facing criticism, and making difficult decisions such as issuing the Emancipation Proclamation. Now, at last, peace seemed possible. Lincoln himself appeared more cheerful than he had in years. He even told his wife, Mary Todd Lincoln, that he felt almost a strange sense of calm, as if a heavy weight had been lifted. But not everyone shared in the joy. For Confederate loyalists, Lincoln represented the destruction of the Southern way of life. He was seen not as a saviour, but as a tyrant who had crushed their independence. And among those bitter men was John Wilkes Booth. John Wilkes Booth was a 26-year-old actor from a well-known theatrical family. Handsome, charismatic, and famous on the stage, Booth was also a passionate supporter of the Confederacy. He believed that Lincoln was a dictator who had ruined the South, and he longed for revenge. Originally, Booth and his co-conspirators had planned to kidnap Lincoln and exchange him for Confederate prisoners of war, but after Lee's surrender, Booth became more desperate. Kidnapping no longer seemed enough. He wanted to strike a blow that would terrify the North and give hope to the collapsing Confederacy. He plotted to kill not only Lincoln, but also Vice President Andrew Johnson and Secretary of State William H. Seward, in the hopes of throwing the U.S. government into chaos. Booth learned that Lincoln and his wife would be attending a play, Our American Cousin, at Ford's Theatre on the evening of April 14th. To him it was the perfect opportunity. Lincoln loved the theatre. Despite the heavy burdens of his office, he often attended plays as a way to relax. That night he was accompanied by his wife, Mary, Major Henry Rathbone, and Rathbone's fiancée, Clara Harris. The presidential party arrived late, and the play had already begun when they took their seats in the private presidential box, decorated with American flags. The audience stood and cheered loudly for the president, and the mood inside was festive. Meanwhile, Booth, familiar with the layout of the theatre as a performer, made his preparations. He entered the theatre around 10 p.m, carrying a small, single-shot Derringer pistol and a knife. Using his knowledge of the building, he slipped behind the scenes and climbed a staircase to the upper level where the presidential box was located. At around 10:15 p.m, as the audience roared with laughter at one of the play's funniest lines, Booth opened the door to Lincoln's box, aimed his pistol, and fired. The bullet entered the back of Lincoln's head just behind his left ear and lodged behind his right eye. The president slumped forward instantly, unconscious. Major Rathbone leapt up to grab Booth, but Booth slashed him deeply in the arm with his knife. Booth then vaulted over the railings of the presidential box onto the stage below, but his spur caught on a flag draped over the box. He landed awkwardly, breaking his leg. And despite his injury, Booth quickly rose, brandished his knife and shouted either "Sic semper tyrannis," Latin for "thus always to tyrants," or simply "the South is avenged." Witnesses disagreed on the exact words. He then rushed across the stage and out the back door, where his horse was waiting. Within moments he had vanished into the night. Inside the theatre, chaos erupted. The audience screamed in shock, actors stopped the play, and people rushed towards the president's box. Doctors were immediately called for. One young army surgeon, Charles Leal, reached the president first. He examined Lincoln and realised the wound was fatal and there was no hope of recovery. Still, he tried to ease the president's breathing by removing blood clots and keeping his airway open. It was clear Lincoln could not survive a trip to the White House. Instead, he was carried across the street to the Peterson House, a small boarding house. There, in a back bedroom, Lincoln was laid on a bed that was too short for his tall frame, so his body had to be placed at an angle. All through the night, doctors, cabinet members, and family gathered around. Mary Todd Lincoln wept uncontrollably, often having to be escorted from the room. Cabinet Secretary Edwin Stanton took charge, sending messages, organising guards and questioning witnesses, even as he watched the president's slow decline. Lincoln never regained consciousness. He breathed heavily throughout the night, sometimes gasping, sometimes almost peaceful, and at 7:22 a.m. on April 15, 1865, he took his final breath. Stanton, with tears in his eyes, is said to have whispered, "Now he belongs to the ages." The news of Lincoln's assassination spread quickly, and the nation was plunged into grief. Bells tolled in cities and towns, businesses closed, and people draped their homes in black. For many Northerners, the joy of victory had been replaced almost overnight by a deep sense of tragedy. Lincoln's funeral train carried his body from Washington to Springfield, Illinois, over a journey of more than 1,600 miles. Along the way, millions of Americans lined the tracks to pay their respects. They stood silently, hats removed, many weeping as the train passed by. In cities such as New York, Chicago, and Philadelphia, huge crowds turned out to see the president's casket. And on May 4th, 1865, Lincoln was finally laid to rest in Oak Ridge Cemetery in Springfield, the town where he had lived before becoming president. But in the 1870s, there was a large counterfeiting ring which was based in Illinois. The gang had issues as one of their leaders was imprisoned, and this led to the gang to be short with money. With this, they had an idea. Big Jim Keneally, the leader of the gang, hatched a plan to steal Lincoln's body and then ransom it off for $200,000. One night, one of the conspirators drank too much and told a woman of the plot, and the gang then left Springfield, but Keneally persisted. He moved to Chicago and set up a new gang, but he didn't know that this one of his recruits was Secret Service agent, so Keneally made the plan to steal Lincoln's body, stuff it into a long sack, and then take it to northern Indiana to be hidden amidst the sand dunes before the ransom would be paid. The grave robbery date was set for the 7th of November, 1876. This was election day, and it was thought the cemetery would be quiet. The gang went into the cemetery, sawed off the padlock of the iron door of Lincoln's tomb, and then began to prise open the sarcophagus's marble lid. They managed to do this, however, they then struggled to lift the heavy wooden iron coffin. This was probably lead-lined, meaning it was very heavy, but then someone ordered to bring horses in to help the job. There were then 8 detectives in hiding at the time. These men had their guns ready and they rushed to the tomb, but the tomb robbers spooked and managed to get out of the estate gate of the cemetery. They were later captured, but then the decision was made in 1901 to bury Abraham Lincoln properly. But in 1901, the body of Lincoln was actually exhumed and the coffin was opened. 2 plumbers opened the lead-lined coffin. A terrible choking smell then came out of the coffin, and it was noticeable that Lincoln's features are recognisable and that he was lifelike. His black hair was there was the wart on his cheek, His suit was covered in yellow mould, but the body had been well preserved. The coffin was then lowered into the cage with 400 pounds of cement poured on top of it. Today, Lincoln lies buried 10 feet beneath the floor of this tomb. One man who witnessed Lincoln's coffin stated, "His face was chalky white, his clothes were mildewed, and I was allowed to hold one of the leather straps as we lowered the casket for the concrete to be poured. I was not scared at the time, but I slept with Lincoln for the next 6 months." Today it's believed that Abraham Lincoln's coffin has been moved at least 17 times due to the reconstructions of the tomb and the building work, and there is a concern as for the safety of his remains. 1901 was the final time the coffin was opened, and it's believed that his remains would have significantly decayed and rotted since then. Thank you for watching, and to support our channel, please make sure to subscribe. And again, thank you so much for watching.